All right, so now we want to talk about written communication. Again, as I said to you, this is proclamation and communication, and so part of communication that we want to talk about is the written part of communication. Writing is a craft that requires practice in order to perfect. And writing can provide a platform of expanded influence if you master the craft at all kinds of different levels, not just writing books. It can be articles, it can just be emails, honestly. It can be Facebook. It can be all kinds of social platforms, obviously blogging. These are just different areas, so we're going to talk about that. In my case, again, for me personally, writing books was a game changer. Was not probably why I started out to write books. I started out writing books because I felt called to. That's why I did it. But I'm telling you, the platform elevation of writing books and selling books, that really makes the difference. By the way, just writing them doesn't give you an influence. You actually have to get them out there. It was a dramatic game changer. So everywhere I go now, I will meet people who have said to me or will say to me, hey, I've read your books, it's changed my life, literally everywhere I go. I have literally sat in churches before that I don't know the people, but I'm visiting or something, I'm passing through, and somebody is sitting in church in front of me with one of my books. That's a weird experience. I was sitting in John Tyson's church one day. John's in Manhattan, and 2 locations, and I've preached for John's church before, but this day I was just visiting. I just happened to be in the city, and I said, hey, let's go to John's church. And so we made a plan. We decided we'd spend the day in New York. He has an evening service, so we hit the evening service. And so I'm sitting there, literally, there's a group of people sitting in front of me who are studying my book together. And they're sitting right there. In this case, it was Soul Care. They're sitting right there in front of me in the pews. And so I just leaned over to one of them at the break and I said, I heard that was a really good book. I had no idea who I was, Just having fun with them. Anyhow, I went to council in 2017. And, this is for us, the CMA, the U.S. CMA. It's a platform of several thousand people. And I had probably 12, 15 people that literally hugged me and started crying. I've never met them. I had no idea who they were. There are people who read my book or who had watched the DVD series on Soul Care, and by the time they were done crying, just said, it changed my life. Well, the reality is, when that stuff starts happening, it expands your influence significantly. For me, when I started writing, I wrote, again, out of obedience. It just was something I felt called towards. And it has been a huge game changer for me. I have no interest in writing a blog. That's not what I feel called to do. I have people all the time say to me, you should write a blog, or this one, you should do a podcast. And, I'm more likely to do a podcast than a blog just because I don't want to write a blog. I don't really have the interest of writing on that kind of a daily basis or a weekly basis. So I want to talk about the different forms of writing today, different communication that's out there. And I want to discuss a few key principles on the subject of writing. We're going to cover everything from emails to writing books in this section. We can talk about other stuff if you want to. I can tell you right now, if I don't have experience in it and I don't know where to get information in it, I'll try to help you find someone who can help you. But I don't know all things. So let's talk about different writing platforms. Let me start with email because everybody deals with email. You could also add texting to this if you want to. We'll talk about that also. Email was originally intended to make our lives easier. Yeah, that didn't work. But now it's a necessary evil. That's all it is. It actually has not made my life simpler. It's made my life way more complex. The problem with being a public figure, which if you write on some of these other platforms that we talk about and you do become successful and you become a public figure, the problem is anybody can discover your email and write to you. And it's not just email. I literally get Facebook people, you know, because I travel all over the world and speak, and so people Facebook friend me from all over the planet. Well, as long as you have your clothes on, I say yes. I mean, that's pretty much my only rule of thumb. If you look like you're dressed a little scantily, I ignore you. If you look like you're a reasonable human and you actually know some people that I know, like I look, you have similar friends someplace on the planet, I say yes. But now they can Facebook message you. You are totally available to some person you've never met. Okay? Twitter. Anybody can follow me on Twitter. Anybody can message me, direct message me on Twitter. I have had hundreds of Facebook messages, hundreds of Twitter messages, hundreds of emails from around the world from people I have never met. Okay? This has not made life simpler. This has been incredibly complex. And the reality is, I am thousands of emails behind all the time and have no intention of ever catching up. And I feel no pressure or obligation to answer email. None. Why? Because it's an unfair game. There's no way I can ever keep up. It's impossible. I can't do it. And I just ignore stuff. That's what I do. Okay? Now, hear me for a second. I have people that, when they listen to me say stuff like this, they get offended. I've had people say to me, that's rude. And I just look at them and say, you are an idiot. You have no idea the life that I live. How many of you get thousands of emails from people you've never met? Not advertisers. It's impossible for me to keep up. So you have to, again, establish boundaries. That's just part of life. Listen, even if it's just the people in ministry, and you have a church that's a decent-sized church, a ministry that's a decent-sized ministry that you're a part of, you won't be able to keep up either. It's just part of life. You can't keep up. So for me personally, I just realized I have to do some of this and I can't do lots of this, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time apologizing about that. And I have to decide what I have to do. So what I do is I prioritize what I need to get done in email. And I am not terribly committed to answering email. That's life, and that's the way I choose to do it. What I can tell you from this angle, from someone who has some degree of, a high volume of email, if you're writing to someone like that, dear God, keep it short. Please, really get to the point. Honor people's time. I used to say to my staff all the time, I had staff members they just could not succinctly and concisely express themselves. They were too verbose. And I would say to them, you've written me 5 pages on email, you just need to know I'm never going to read it. I'm not going to read it. Now, write 1 paragraph and tell me exactly what you want. Get to the point. Okay? If you're going to write me 5 pages, call me. And then discipline your words. But if you're going to write 5 pages, I'm not going to read it. I'm not. Okay? By the way, this applies to you as well, just so you know. I literally have people all over the world who write me their total life confession, write me their life story, literally all over the world. I don't read those things. I get 20-page emails all the time from people. I can't read that. I can't do that. Solve my soul issues. Yeah, right, great. In 5 seconds or less, fix that. Okay? Can't do that. With me, the other piece that I said to my staff, if you really need my time and you need something like that, text me and say, I need to talk to you. And I'll call you as soon as I can. And that's what I do. That worked a lot better than answering huge emails. That was not a good mode of communication. The other thing with email, be very careful with stuff that you write. This is a public record and a legal record in a court of law at this point. Do not spout off in an email in your frustrated state. Don't ever do that. Someone can use that crap against you. Don't do that. I never, ever respond emotionally in an email. Ever. Ever. Never. Because this is not the space for it. So, honor people's time and also honor people when you're dealing with email. And I've had a lot of really nasty emails over the years where people are undisciplined with their words and their time, and also their tones and so on. And I don't respond to that stuff. I go directly to the person. You know what? The problem with all the forms of social media and written communication that are available to people directly today is you don't have to be kind to someone. And you would write things you would never say to someone. If you look them in the eye, you would treat them with honor. But because you can write it, you can spout off whatever you want, and you're not acting like you're responsible for your tones. You are incredibly responsible for your words. And like I said, nowadays, this is a legal access point in a court of law. So be incredibly careful with email. Do not spout off. If somebody spouts off on you, do not do it back. Rise above that stuff. Don't be like that. Instead, meet them face to face and deal with it. I just had a situation where this happened. Not to me, to a friend of mine. But they wrote to me about him and made an accusation against him on an email. And I immediately responded to the person and said, you need to talk directly to him. Have you talked directly to him? No. Who else have you told? About a half a dozen other people. They're making an accusation, which in my mind is not true, and I've told a half a dozen people, and now I'm in that half a dozen, and I'm the only person that had called them on. This has been going on for over 2 years. And I was the first person that called them on. I don't let stuff like that go. Immediately dealt with it and had a conversation and helped this thing get cleared, and I think we've cleared the air at this point. It looks like we have. However, that came through email. That's where it actually started as a Facebook message, and I shifted the conversation to email because I hate Facebook message. By the way, for you, if you do ever want to communicate, use my NIAC email. Don't go through E360. I hate E360. It's a terrible system. I can't respond to it on my phone. Shoot me an email directly. You're much more likely to get it. And then keep it short. This really was meant to be a business platform. That's really the best use of the email. It's not personal, it's business. It's good for a quick ministry check-in. It's good for requesting appointments. It's good for a quick exchange of information. It wasn't meant to be a substitute for something that would be far more face-to-face communication oriented, like dealing with conflict. People who try to deal with stuff like conflict over email only get more conflicted most of the times. No one can see your tone on an email. No one can see your facial expressions on an email. And so people get misunderstood on email all the time because no one can see those things. They can't hear your heart, okay? So for me, I stay out of all of that murky area of conflict in email altogether. I don't deal with any of that stuff on email. I deal with that stuff directly with people face to face. Do not use it to resolve conflict, and don't send emails in anger. You have to be honorable. So please, restraint. Use restraint and write after you've calmed down. Meet people face to face to deal with conflict, or this stuff gets ugly fast. And I can tell you lots of really ugly stories along these lines. Second, let's talk about texting. Texting, great for short relational interactions and communications. Quick conveniences, small bites of information. Again, I got to tell you, this stuff's legal record these days. I know people who have gotten sued in church work over texting for emotional stuff that they wrote, sexual stuff that they wrote, and they got summons. Their records, their phone records were summons, and they lost because of their texting. This stuff, you got to be really careful. A number of years ago, I was texting a staff member, and I'm very, very honest, direct. I hug my staff. I'm very affectionate with my staff, and I write affectionate things to my staff. I love people, male, female. It's not uncommon for me to hug my male staff members, female staff members, to text them, I love you. That stuff would be normative for me. I try to create an atmosphere of family that would be perfectly normal. I'm sure I've written I love you to Mary before on a text that would be totally normal for me to do, okay? So one day I'm texting with a staff member. She's a young girl. I think she was single at the time. She's married now. I think she was single then. But she texts me, and she's young. I mean, she's a few years younger than me. She texts me and writes, "I love you." Well, again, I write that all the time on staff, so I just write back, "Love you too." And I get a text back. She writes, "I mean, I love you." And I'm like, I think we just shifted planes here. I'm pretty sure we're not on the same page anymore. And I wrote back, I don't think I mean the same thing you mean. She writes, "I mean, I'm in love with you." Now, this is a lady that worked for me for a number of years. And so I walked out into the kitchen with my phone. I sat down with Jen and I said, "I need you to interact with this conversation with me. Sit right here, don't move." And I responded, said, "That is not what I mean. It's not what I've ever meant." I said, "I say this to both male and female staff. I said, I have no sexual intent whatsoever. There's no I'm in love with you stuff going on in my soul. I mean, I love you like a sister." And she goes, "I know," and my wife's sitting right next to me while I'm interacting, "I know you feel the same way I do." I said, "No, I don't." And so I went on with this thing back and forth for her. Listen, at the end of the day, she had to leave my staff. That's what happens with this kind of stuff. And in the interaction with her, I said to her at one point, this is probably an over conversation, with someone else in the room by that stage. I said, "Listen, this crossed a line for you emotionally." I said, "You made the key mistake that people make, and that is they take it to fantasy." So listen, your feelings can get sideways. Anybody's can. But when that thing goes from emotional sideways feelings, like I'm feeling like energy with this person and it feels like maybe I'm falling for this person, you can't take that to the realm of fantasy. As soon as you start having fantasy with that person in your head and they're part of your future and you're doing dinners with them and you're fantasizing about all kinds of interactions, you're telling them you love them and they love you, and you're done. It's over. You lost. I would never allow that kind of space to happen in my head. Okay? Just don't. Once you cross that line, it's so much easier to cross that next line of the physical. And so I just went, "No, you crossed that line. I would never cross that line. I've never crossed that line with any of my staff, and I never will. That's not where I'm going with this stuff at all." Okay? So anyhow, in this case, it ended up in a really bad deal. We ended up losing her as staff, which was really crappy because she was a great staff person, and I loved having her on the team. So just be really, really careful with this stuff. Again, please remember, this is now legal in a court of law. Someone can sue you with your texting. So you better be careful. Sexting. Wow. I mean, I can't tell you. I lost another staff person who ended up in an emotional attachment with a woman that he had met during, sort of health fitness stuff, and he ended up, sort of attaching first, emotionally and texting emotional stuff, and then later on, it moved into the sexting stuff, kind of. Wow. Again, I caught him in this. I think his wife told me, and I confronted him on it. He lied to me. And his phone is my phone. We own the phone. We have access to the text. He lost. And he was gone. And the bottom line on this stuff is be careful with texting. Recognize there's a lot of emotional information, a lot of emotional tones that gets exchanged in this. And it's easy for people to get sideways on these things. Don't engage in that stuff. Be really, really super careful with this stuff. And again, even that thing where I will write to someone, "I love you." Wow, man. Tone, attitude, intent really matters. But on a text, you can't tell any of that. You can't tell a thing. So make sure you're really having direct conversations and staying out of the emotionally sticky stuff. because it's become a major problem. Unfortunately, I sit on Dexcom, the district executive committee, for years, and I can't tell you how many times we've run into these kinds of issues that started with texting. It's huge. Please beware, and let's not fall prey to this stuff. Show restraint. Again, don't text in anger. Don't do conflict on text. It's just a lousy way. It's not what it's made for, so don't do that. And whatever you do, make sure you're taking time away from all this craziness. Shut it off from time to time. Don't let it own you. There's actually a book out there called I Disorder. And his whole thing with this book is this thing has created new levels of anxiety. It's a psychological term that has been created because so many people are so connected so often, never disconnecting, that they've actually got a new level of anxiety that they describe as I disorder. That is, it's connected to your iPhone and all that kind of smartphone stuff. And what they basically discovered is people that don't ever shut it off carry around new levels of anxiety in their souls. And if you take away their phone in a silent retreat, they freak out. Like, freak out on you. So at the end of the day, make sure you're actually disconnecting from some of this stuff. I mean, I've been with people who are literally sitting, you've been too, with people who are sitting down and they never talk to you because they're busy on their phone the whole time, texting with other people. I've had people who've asked me to sit with them because they wanted mentoring, and the entire time I'm sitting with them, they're texting someone else. I just get up and leave. Don't waste my time. I told you. Don't ever waste my time. I don't have time for that. This thing, literally one day sitting with one of my youth pastors told me this story. He was sitting with two teenagers who were in a fight with each other, and they're right next to each other. They're on a trip, on a missions trip together, and they're texting each other next to each other and not talking to each other. They're next to each other, and they wouldn't talk. I'm like, this is dysfunctional. Listen, when you're dysfunctional is normal, it's still dysfunctional. This is new levels of dysfunctional, okay? Wow. So this stuff, just please, don't let it substitute for communication face-to-face. We've lost something in our society. We need to talk to each other directly and never use these kinds of cheap communications for conflict resolution, ever. It's just not the right approach. So, let's talk about social media for a minute. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all the rest. Snapchat, all that stuff. They can be incredible time wasters. So first of all, when you're out there, just make sure you're monitoring your time so you're not wasting tons of time, especially when you're tired. They seem to pop up with greater regularity the more tired you are. They can easily keep you up, from the most important things. Again, this is my personal approach. I'm not advocating it. I'm just telling you how I manage it. You have to work out your own personal approach. With me, with Facebook, I never go on anybody else's page. All I ever do is use it for a platform for what I want to use it for. I write once in a while personal stuff out there in terms of family stuff or something like that. That's really just because you have people that are kind of interested in you when you're a public figure at some level. And two, I use it for ministry stuff. I use it to write devotional things sometimes. I use it for prayer support sometimes because I have people that pray for me. And so I use it for information. It's much easier a prayer letter than a prayer letter, way easier. And I can shoot it out quick. It's really short, and people can pray. It's incredibly helpful. That's kind of how I use that. That's all I do with it. Now, when I turn on, if I flip on Facebook right now, it usually comes up on the news feed. Okay? I don't scroll the news feed, ever. Now, the very first thing, today, this happened. Today, the very first thing was a friend of mine's anniversary. I wouldn't know it was his anniversary, except it happened to pop up on the news feed. It was the very first. So I hit like and never read anything else. That was it. And moved on to what I wanted to access. Somebody had written me something, and I just looked at that, and that was it. I had a staff guy planted a church. His approach with this social media stuff, he used to use it all the time for outreach things and community things. And it was great. It was a great approach for him. okay? But he spent way more time out there on this platform than I did, because then he's interacting with all these people when he's doing this stuff. And that's okay if that's what you want to do. Here's what I would suggest. This is the most important thing. Develop a philosophy that works for your ministry and stick to it. Don't let it overwhelm your life. Why do you do what you do? If you don't have a good reason for why you're doing what you're doing, then you're probably going to misuse it. Like, I have a very good reason for my approach. Louis had a very good reason for his approach. It worked for what he was trying to accomplish, and he had a philosophy. That's what you have to think about. Why are you doing what you're doing? And for me personally, I just didn't want to waste a bunch of time out there on this stuff. If I want to stay in touch with my friends, it's not going to be on Facebook. Okay? I'll text them, call them, and hang out with them. But I'm not going to do it on Facebook. It's just not. And honestly, most of the people that I stay in touch with are my closest friends. Those are the ones that I kind of hang out with. So I don't need to connect with them on Facebook. Next thing on social media. Twitter is a great platform to learn to write succinct, memorable one-liners. That's all I use Twitter for. So all I do with Twitter is this. I craft these one-liners that I use one-liners all the time. I craft them and shoot them out on Twitter. It's perfect. It's 144 characters. Now they've expanded a little bit, but you know, if you can't say it in 144 characters, really, it's just too long. For a one-liner, it's too long. And so, you know, one-liners should be short, succinct, but actually, like your main idea that you're crafting, that's a great place to actually put a little effort into it, craft it, and shoot it out. Get a good one-liner and blast it out. This is a place to hone word choice. And that's a craft that is learned. It's an art. It's not a science. And so this one has to be developed, and that's a great platform for that. So that's how I use Twitter. Again, unfortunately, you know, everybody can Twitter message you and all that kind of stuff if you get out there and you get a following or something like that. Once again, though, please show restraint. The things that you write are public record. And if you write without honor or regard for others, you will actually lose influence. Louis C.K. does this one skit where he's talking about cell phones. He's talking about why he doesn't. Has anybody ever seen this, by the way, where he's talking about why he doesn't allow his daughters to have cell phones? See this skit? Oh, it's great. It's actually great. And he's telling it on, I think, Conan or something like that, one of those shows. But he's talking about why he doesn't allow his kid to have a cell phone at that time. And of course, he got in trouble afterwards, but this is before he got in trouble. And when he writes this out there, he says, he goes, hey, when you're a phone, he goes, you don't look at people in the face, and he goes, you're a teenager, you're trying things out, he goes, you know, you can write someone, you know, you're fat, and he goes, you don't feel bad when you write it, he goes, but if I say it to your face, and then I see it hurts you, he goes, then I feel bad, he goes, but he goes, if I don't feel bad, and I write it, he goes, I feel good, I think, oh, that felt good, you know, and he goes, the problem when you don't have social connection, you just have some tiny little thing out there, is you could say stuff that's mean and have no social ramifications. Now hear me, I think I said this to you. Did I talk to you about tolerance as the number one value? Did we talk about that in here? No. We did, didn't we? Dorcas, I did. And I talked about tolerance as the number one value. The problem is we become intolerant because we have the wrong definition of tolerance, right? We define tolerance as everybody has a right to their opinion, everybody's opinion is equally valid. That's not tolerance, that's insanity, right? We become less tolerant because of social media platforms. So what happens is now somebody disagrees with me, I can just blast them. I can call them names. I can do it from a platform with no engagement, no relationship, and no ramification. Listen, I'm telling you something right now. You lose influence. I have a friend that's out on Facebook and they are angry all the time. And they wrote one day that got back to me that was highly insulting to any white male in ministry, ever. All white men. And I went, yeah, you lost all credibility with me over this. Like, all credibility. Because you just did something that was so rude to all of us. And you know, I did this girl's deliverance. I sat with her through inner healing. I've carried her through her darkest seasons. And she threw us all under the bus as if we're all worthless. And I went, yeah, you lost all credibility with me on this one. But it's just because she's angry. And she shows no restraint on social media. That is not going to be good for your ministry. And so I'm just telling you right now, figure out how to say what you want to say in an honorable way, even when it's justice issues. Just because it's a justice issue doesn't mean you have a right to be unjust in your approach to others. If you're going to do justice issues in a dishonorable way, you are as unjust as those who have been unjust to you. Treat people with dignity and respect and stand your ground. And do it with love and honor. You do that, you gain credibility and a voice. But if you're bitter and angry and slam other people, you're losing credibility, man. Don't do that. Okay? Figure out. I think I might have said this to you, but if I didn't, this is the phrase that I use. This true spiritual leader in every room is the most magnanimous person in the room. When you forfeit magnanimity, you forego spiritual authority. If you want to gain credibility and authority, you have to sustain magnanimity. Even when the topics get controversial, you don't get the right to become reckless with your words. And unfortunately, all this social media stuff has allowed recklessness and dishonor to run amok in our midst. And it's just not Christian, gang. I think you need to be direct and honest, but it's not these platforms that gives you a reckless right. That's just not true. I think it's been terrible. Next piece, blogging / articles. Again, it's an opportunity to expand influence, to have a voice. I personally have never taken to blogging. I mean, I've done occasional blogs. It just, if you're really going to build a platform, you have to be consistent with it, and it just takes time, and you have to persist. And for me, it's just never been that appealing. And so I guess partially it's because I've been busy writing sermons, and I haven't really had the time to do blogs and sermons, and so I would prefer to write sermons than blogs. That's just me personally. That's not bad. It just is. Articles, again, it also takes persistence, but there's a lot of articles, opportunities out there. This is actually, so blogging, the hard part's getting a following. That's actually the hard part, is actually trying to get a following. You have to be really consistent to get that. Articles, the good news is you can shoot one out to any magazine. Well, I'll tell you right now, it's a lot easier to get what is a denominational magazine, in our case, the Christian Missionary Alliance, the Alliance Life magazine, now they call it A-Life, and in Canada they call it A-Connection, versus trying to get in a big magazine like Christianity Today or Leadership Magazine. I'll just tell you right now, the chances of you getting an article printed in this stuff at this level, not great, right? You got a church of 10,000? Yeah, they'll plan. They'll print the article, absolutely. You write a book that sells 35,000 copies, 100,000 copies? Sure, they'll print. But these kinds of magazines, they're looking for stuff all the time. There's a lot of startup magazines, because I've written on soul care. I had a startup magazine in psychology ask me to submit an article for sort of healthy soul stuff. And when they solicited me, I didn't go after them. They solicited me. And I said to them, I go, listen, this is a psychology magazine. All your audience and authors are all psychologists. I'm not a counselor. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a counselor. I'm a pastor, and I'm writing on soul. Yeah, we'd love to have your contribution. They're not Christian. I'm Christian. I'm like, you guys are nuts. So anyways, I haven't actually written one for that, but I have written multiple times for the Alliance Life, Alliance Connection, and it was a nice way to quick write articles, and really at this point, I pretty much only write when they seek me out, which they do at least a couple times a year. Okay? I've seen some excellent bloggers who have never been able to develop a large following. And why? I don't really know, honestly, what the deal is with some of that stuff. What I should tell you on that is, honestly, if you're going to choose to write, and if you feel called to write, just trust your influence level to God. That's true about books. So for me personally, I was writing books, and I trusted the influence level to God. I don't write books because I want to have success. I write books because I feel called to write books. That's why I wrote. I felt like I was honoring God with what I was doing, and I wrote on the theme I felt God called me to write. When I was 24 years old, God, He gave me a vision for my life. He said, you're going to plant a church, a cell church, you're going to pastor church, then you're going to teach in seminary, you're going to write books, you're going to teach leaders internationally. That's true for my life at this point. I'm literally living out the vision that God gave me for my life, okay? But what I did was I prayed this prayer at that time when I was 24. I said, Lord, I'll do whatever you ask me to do. I'll never open my own doors. You open the door and I'll follow. And I literally, all I did was opened up a desktop folder called Book Ideas. That was all I did. And when I got an idea, just like sermon ideas, I threw the idea in there. And I never wrote anything. I just threw it in there and I waited for the Lord. And when I was 40, I sensed the Lord say to me, now it's time to write. I release you to write. And so I said, Lord, if that's you, then you're going to have to confirm that, because I don't want to, just do that because I feel that. So let me just make sure that's really you and not my own emotion. And the next month, I had 4 people come up to me who had no idea that the Lord had said this to me when I was 24. And all 4 people started the sentence with, are you writing a book? I feel like God's told you to write a book. The first one was a woman who occasionally would show up at my church. Her daughter attended my church. She would visit her daughter and she would show up, a couple times a year. And she was a Congregationalist, a New England Congregationalist. Just for the record, these are not wild-eyed Pentecostals. They're very, very staid conservative people and tend not to have any charismatic flair at all. None. Okay? She says to me, she writes me an email. She goes, I was out taking a walk in the woods and I heard the audible voice of God, and He told me to tell you to write a book. And then she apologized profusely. I'm so sorry. I know you're so busy. You teach at seminary, pastor, And she said, but I really feel that I needed to tell you. Now, what she didn't know was she was the first one right after I heard the Lord release me. And I said, you're an answer to my prayer. I knew since I was 24, the Lord called me to write. I sensed Him saying last week that it was time to write, and you are an answer to prayer. She goes, oh, I'm so glad. Now let me tell you the rest of what God told me. And then she laid out 2 prophetic words for my books that I have prayed over ever since, every week of my life. That were dramatic, significant words. Okay? Those words have been a beacon in all the darkness of my life. And again, I had 3 other people come up to me and give me words in the next month. It was fabulous, right? So I knew God had released me to write. Now, what you have to understand in that context is writing books is a lot different. And so I'm going to get to that in a second. Let me talk to you about letters for a second. Nearly a thing of the past. Hardly anybody ever writes a letter. But it is a powerful thing to receive a personal letter still, or a handwritten note of thanks. Now, hear me, especially from someone of influence in their life. So for you personally, as a leader in the local church, if you would take time to write somebody a personal note of thanks for what they're doing, I'm telling you, man, it goes a long ways. A long ways. But some of you guys are youth pastors. You take the opportunity to write a youth a personal letter. It goes a long ways to touch someone's heart. Bill Hybels, was pastor of a giant church in this season when I was a youngster in ministry, and I wrote him a note one time to thank him for something that I was involved in, he was involved in, and thank him for his influence on my life at that point in time. The guy wrote me a personal note back. Okay, I'm a young guy at the time. This was 25 years ago. I was a kid, and he was a well-known pastor, and at the time, listen, I never forgot that note. Never forgot that note. I could name dozens of other people that Bill Hybels wrote personal notes to like that. Dozens, I know, that received that stuff. He's a busy guy. Notes to leaders, notes to people who serve, notes to givers if you're a senior pastor in a church, or if you're running an organization like Ruth's and somebody's given you a donation. Just these kinds of notes, personal notes, go a long, long ways to touch someone's life. So it's a great, still not very well used, but a great platform. Business letters. Listen, for the business community out there, there's a ton of templates that you can follow for business letters. You can find them in books, you can find them online. When it's a legal matter, please seek a lawyer. Find a lawyer in your church, hire a lawyer if you need to, but when you're dealing with a legal matter, man, don't write a business letter without seeking a lawyer. We live in an incredibly litigious society, and there would love to be people to sue your church, sadly. So be very careful along these lines. This is the new reality. In our case, again, as a member of Dexcom a number of years ago, we had an old guy who we got a letter on one time from a parishioner. And the letter we received, this guy had been in our district for 50 years. He was in his 70s. The letter we received, the parishioner said that the pastor had borrowed money from them and never paid it back. So we get this letter and we called the person. Again, I'm not part of this Dexcom, so sometimes that means you have to do disciplinary stuff, right? This is not fun. So anyways, we made some phone calls. What we discovered at the end of the day was this, after we did a little back research on this thing. The guy had borrowed money from every church he'd ever been in, and people in every church he'd ever been in, and he had about $150,000 worth of debt that he never paid back. And nobody ever called him on it until this one person. And he had just had this long history of taking money and never paying a dime back, right? So anyways, we call this guy up to have a meeting and to have a conversation with this stuff, and of course we wrote a letter. We sought a lawyer out because we knew that this was a potential litigious situation, right? So we saw a lawyer, made sure we were covering all our bases and didn't get our butts sued, and the guy sued us. Sued us anyways. Now, the good news is, the guy died, and so we never got sued. Took care of that problem. The bad news is, those people never got their money back. Now, we'll say this on this stuff. Seriously, be careful. We live in an incredibly litigious world. When we did business deals, buying properties, selling things, whatever, any kind of legal matter on the district level, local church level, we always sought out lawyers to deal with this stuff. Because you just got to be really, really careful. And so, when it's business letters, just get help. There's plenty of stuff out there to help you. Now I'll talk about books. It is very difficult to get published today, given the industry. I'm just going to tell you that right now. So when I wrote my first book, I actually had a friend connect me with somebody who was the president of Zondervan, which is a rare opportunity to talk to somebody like that if you're a brand new author. He didn't know me from Adam. I had zero platform with him whatsoever. It just happened to be a mutual friend. So anyways, this guy says to me, he goes, listen, at the time, what was the name? Heaven is for Real had just been published, right? And it hit New York Times, #1 bestseller, all this stuff. So he says to me, listen, he goes, unless you died and went to heaven, you can't write a book today unless you have a huge platform. He goes, that's just the nature of the industry. Nobody's making money on books. The book industry has greatly changed. So he said, if you've died and gone to heaven, you got a story like that, you can get published. He goes, if you don't have that story, unless your church is a church of 30,000, you have no chance of getting published today by a publishing house. No chance whatsoever. And so I said, okay, there you go. So then I knew. So I immediately realized if I was going to publish and follow through with this thing, I was probably going to have to self-publish. It was probably the only way I could do it. So let me give you some stats. You ready? Here you go. President of Xulon, who is the Tom Frayling right here, who is the largest Christian self-publishing house in the world. The president of Xulon said the average book in its lifetime, self-published book, sells 91 copies in its lifetime. in its lifetime. Publisher Weekly, okay, so these guys are secular, looking at a much larger audience. They were looking at published books through a publishing house, and they said the average book in a publishing house sells 3,000 copies. That's average book, okay? That would include things like Harry Potter, which sold hundreds of millions of copies in all of its renditions and so forth. So, the average book selling that many means there's a ton that are selling way less than 3,000. Way less than 3,000. Just to give you a feel for this, I'm just telling you this stuff so you understand what you're up against and why you publish. You need to know why you do what you do in life. When I sell a book on Amazon, right, so one of my books sells on Amazon, I make $4 off that book if it's a paperback copy. Well, you need to understand that comes after my cost, okay? So the chances are I'm lucky to make $2 on every book that I sell on Amazon. I'm lucky if I make $2. And the reality is Amazon makes the vast majority of the product, okay? They're making a ton of money off of every author, and you're making nothing as the author. So, just do the math. At the end of the day, if you are going to sell 100,000 copies as a self-published person, that would be less than 0.1% of the people out there in the industry. And for you to sell 100,000, be lucky if you can make $200,000 in the lifetime of a book. This is not a get-rich-quick scheme, okay? Nobody writes to make money anymore. You don't do that. So the reason why you're writing this kind of stuff is actually for influence. You're trying to help people to come to know truths of God in our case. And so, you have to understand that. There's not a huge amount of money in this, and it's just not reality. People aren't getting famous and rich off of books too often in this industry. It's easy to self-publish, but the way it works is this. You have a menu of options. So this is how it works, the gist of it. I call up my publisher, I say, I want to publish a new book. He says, it's going to cost you X amount of dollars to print the book. It's going to cost you X amount of dollars to file the book with the Congress, Library of Congress. It's going to cost you X amount of dollars if you want to promote the book. It's going to cost you X amount of dollars if you want the book edited. It's going to cost you X amount of dollars if you want the book to be in magazines, where people who are book buyers would look at it and see it and decide if they want it on their shelves. By the time you're done with all those X, it costs you X amount of dollars then to publish a certain number of the books. So, for example, when I printed Soul Care, I printed 5,000 copies, and all of those X amount of dollars cost me about $15,000 or so dollars when I first printed Soul Care. That was the first printing. The reality is, it costs you $3. I just told you, make $4 off Amazon. Do the math. You made $1 for every time I sold a book on Amazon the first round. That, by the way, didn't count shipping. So now if you include shipping, you probably made 50 cents a book between shipping back and forth. Okay? So this is the reality of publishing industry today. Just be aware of that before you get into it. Just be aware that it's not that easy to make it. And the process of writing, I'll just talk you through the process of writing. For me personally, and again, lots of writers use similar processes. First thing I always do is create a first draft. That's where I start. Big deal, right? It's not a surprise. So I have an idea where I'm going. I start to draft the book. I draft the concepts. I draft the outline. Then I draft the paper. Draft this thing in terms of the chapters. Then what I do is I hand it to somebody who's my initial editor. This is a friend of mine, somebody who came to church at South Shore, came to faith at South Shore. She's a 4.0 Harvard grad, super smart girl, was an English major, and so I send it to her. She edits it, sends it back to me. We go back and forth probably a dozen times, okay? And she just did this as a friend. I didn't ever pay her. That's not her industry. She was actually working for Harvard at the time, and she just did this in the evenings with me. Then, after she and I finally get to the place where we sign off on this thing and go, this is where I feel comfortable, and now I'm ready to hand it to an editor, then I pay for an editor. the editor that I paid for, worked for Zondervan during the daytime, and at night he moonlighted a little extra money, did editing on books like mine. And so he was great, super good to work with, but it cost me, I don't know, $1,500 or something like that for an editor, okay? It's just going rates. Next, then I handed it to people in my church. And these people that I handed it to were people who were the ones that caught all the mistakes in the bulletin and all the mistakes in the PowerPoint, and they were detailed people by nature. That's who they were, okay? I actually handed it to them and said to them, I want as clean a copy as you can get, so please point out all the mistakes. Please help me. The reality is, then by the time we had the final draft, we'd ship it off to the printer, they'd print it up, and what I can tell you is, having done the first draft of Soul Care, a second draft of Soul Care, a third draft of Soul Care, somebody just came to me 2 weeks ago and said, hey, there's a mistake in Soul Care. Yep, there's always mistakes. There's no such thing as a perfect book, and I'm really pretty thorough with the process and have very few mistakes in my book, generally speaking, but the reality is there's always a mistake, okay? There's no such thing as a clean text. So anyways, this person found still yet another mistake, so I'll clean that up sometimes. Practice. When it comes to writing, it's just like preaching. As in all things, you just get better when you do it. So write out your sermons. This is a great place to practice. I said to you earlier, you write out your sermons, you get better writer. You get much better as a writer. People that don't write out their sermons don't get that better as preachers, and they don't get any better as writers. But if you write out your sermons, you get better at both. Helps with oral clarity in that way, but it also helps you to really, really consider your words. And so I found that writing out my sermons was a great discipline. Take time to carefully word a Twitter post. Do it around your main idea. Really craft your main idea each week. And if you just craft the main idea and you get it in a short little one-sentence Twitter post, just write out your sermons, do that. It'll help. Write out a Facebook, devotional with an attention to detail, crafting words, because it's a short little post. Don't do a huge one. People won't read it anyways. Keep it really short. And it gives you a writing practice. Personally, this is me personally, I wrote out all my prayers. I still write them out a lot. I do my prayers on a computer. I just go straight into written. And just regular devotional stuff. Part of this is kind of like a prayer journal. So I'm processing all my emotional stuff in there. And I want it to get processed. So I write it down to give me clarity around it again. And I write down what I sense God speaking to me in there. But in all of that writing process, actually get better at writing. It really helps. And I also, again, sort of get feedback on the writing process. Notice the amount of people that read through the books. I had a professional editor. I had my wife read through it. I had Andy read through it. I had proofreaders read through it. I was soliciting feedback. And then you also get people that give you unsolicited feedback on your writing too, and that's okay. And you can learn from all this stuff. It's really helpful if you actually practice writing. And honestly, in ministry, there's a ton of it. You have a ton of writing you have to do. Between letters, like business letters and so forth, congregational letters, emails, texts, all these social media avenues, writing your sermon. There's a lot of writing that you're doing on a regular basis in ministry. It's normal living. So you can actually have an opportunity, if you work it, to get really good at it. All right, last thing that I'll cover, and then we'll take a break, and that is, with writing, if you go deep with God, you'll actually have something to say that's productive when you write. Writing, like all communication, comes down to what you say and how you say it. So the bottom line is, if you have something substantive in your soul happening, what you say will have some meat to it. Then if you can learn the craft of writing, which takes practice, how you say it can actually have some appeal to it. And so having something worthwhile to say takes depth wisdom, maturity, time, development. It takes abiding, all those things that we've talked about previously. That stuff's necessary to get to the depth that you need. Too many emotional and spiritual outputs without enough emotional and spiritual inputs makes for a thin soul. And at the end of the day, you can be the best writer in the world, but if you don't have any depth to it, who cares? Listen, most of the Christian stuff that's out there is kind of psych pop stuff without much depth. I'm not even interested in it. It doesn't grab me at all. By the heart, by the throat, by anything. It just doesn't even interest me. And that's not the kind of writing I want to contribute to. So the stuff I do, I want to really have some depth to it. This stuff all happens within your rhythm, within your vital union, within your rest, work, rhythm, all that stuff. That's the only way that stuff gets developed. It's got to get developed here first. It's not about the techniques of preaching or writing. It's about the depth of the heart and soul. You get that stuff down, you can learn the techniques. You don't get that stuff down, even if you have the techniques, it won't happen. Okay? And that's where it starts. Writing principles. Here, just one of the big principles. Please proofread your stuff that you write, whether it's email, whether it's, a letter, whether it's a blog. It's easy to miss mistakes, so if you have to, in my case, it's not uncommon. I have other people proofread my stuff too. My wife's a good detail person. I have her proofread stuff. Here's the thing. When churches, schools, other organizations send out stuff that has lots of typos, grammatical mistakes, spelling mistakes, it looks incredibly unprofessional. Incredibly unprofessional. And we get mistakes all the time from letters from schools. It drives me nuts. I am not at all perfectionistic, at all. It is not my personality to be perfectionist, at all. I don't have any perfectionistic bone in my body. But this is unprofessional stuff, especially if you're working for an educational institution. Dear God, someone edit this thing and look professional, okay? We get letters every week from our school system, where my kids go to school, with mistakes in it. And I'm like, you are educating my child. You're idiots. Please, hire someone to proofread this. This isn't hard. I said to you, in the book process, writing process, we edited, Andy and I, back and forth a dozen times. I hire a professional editor and then send it to a dozen proofreaders, and I still have found mistakes. So there's always going to be a little bit, but man, that's a whole book. Not just a letter. You can eliminate mistakes in a letter, so proofread, clean it up. Really matters. If you ever want to be a good writer, you've got to proofread. It's just part of writing. It's part of the writing process. Now hear me for a second. Friends, I'm a professor. I get papers all the time that are not worthy of 9th grade grammar class. They are trash on paper. And that should not be at a graduate level. So get some help if you need some help, but get the editing. Just get it edited. And at the end of the day, if you edit it, it looks better. Besides that, if you get a good editor, it makes you a better writer. You pick up on things. You learn. It's helpful. So just clean it up. Next one. If you want to be a good writer, read good writers. How do you learn? Learn from one of the best if you're going to learn. So one of the best ways to learn a new skill is to learn from people who are really good at it. You want to be a better preacher? Listen to great preachers. Don't learn how to be a good preacher by listening to a lousy preacher. Not going to help you. The best you'll do is learn what not to do. Don't learn what not to do. Learn what to do. And same with this. In this case, read widely. All different fields. All different periods of times in history. Novels. I find novels are actually great for character development stuff if you get a great one. Some of the modern novels are all action-based novels. They're not my favorite novels at all. I like character-based novels. They actually give you insights into the soul, and that's helpful to me. There's some depth to them and their understanding of human nature. That's incredibly helpful in preaching, too. Very helpful in preaching, because they'll give you real insight. With a plot writer, you know, it's all about the suspense and the action. Here's the good news. They teach you about suspense. Again, it's not my particular genre. I'd much rather have somebody that was a character writer, character-based, character development-based writer. However, even this has to have suspense. When suspense is broken, the talk, the book, whatever you're doing, it's over. Okay? And so, when you read good stuff like that, you can learn. You can read word choice. There's certain writers that are just brilliant with word choice. Brilliant. So you can learn how to turn a phrase better by reading good writers. And it's not just novels. These are just examples that I've learned from. You know, I mean, I like really good writers in all different fields. Personally, one of my favorite writers, Dickens, one of my all-time favorite books. My all-time favorite novel is A Christmas Carol. I've read that novel more than any other. He just really is a terrific writer. Here's this one on Scrooge. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. Secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. Brilliance. Brilliant. This right here, where he goes through this list of words right there. They're just brilliant. This, where he's using images, he's using metaphors too. Sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck. And this one, solitary as an oyster. I mean, those are just great metaphors. When you read Scrooge, or you'll read Dickens and about Scrooge, you'll discover he has these great word choices. I mean, these words are fabulous for Scrooge. And you'll also discover he uses a ton of metaphors. Again, just learn good stuff from these guys. And once again, please, in the writing process, show respect, show restraint. More and more, social media, rather than direct face-to-face communication, has produced a culture of shame. We shame each other, we express our anger in unhealthy ways that we would never do with people that we were sitting down over coffee with. It is un-Christ-like behavior, and it is damaging his name on the planet and the cause of Christ. We need to wrap that stuff up. It's time for us to figure out how to express our opinions about things that are really, really important to us, but preserve people's dignity and respect in the process. Because that's the way Jesus was. He respected even sinners who were far from God, which he got a lot of crap for. Abraham Lincoln wrote letters to people when he was angry with them. And what he would do is he would write a letter, he would tell them off in the letter, and then he would put the letter in the desk and never send it. What he was doing was he was getting it up and out and never doing the thing he wanted to do, which was tell them off. Okay? Then what he would do is have a face-to-face conversation with the person, and in the face-to-face conversation, he would tone it down and say it, and say what he needed to say. But he would do it with dignity and respect. Today, we need to be careful with this kind of stuff, with text, with emails, Facebook responses and wars. Just don't send stuff like that. Draft them, save them, let them sit, be careful with them, make sure you can say it with dignity and respect. And I told you the story before about the issue of somebody attacking us with white privilege and talking about no white man has anything decent to offer to anyone kind of stuff. And I'm like, wow. I did your deliverance, did your inner healing, and you've dismissed every single white guy. And by the way, the three most influential people in her life were three white guys here on campus, which she has admitted and then also attacked us. So, whatever. Issues are issues, and they need to be discussed. People are people, and they need to be loved and respected. Separate your issue from people. State your opinions strongly. Hold your ground. Absolutely. Deal with justice issues. Absolutely. Be prophetic. Absolutely. And treat people with respect at the same time. You can do both. It's not either or. Please, it's both and. Please do both and. Be kind and direct. Not just direct and reckless, but kind and direct. Especially when it comes to writing. This is far more an issue with writing than preaching today. Now, I will pause and say this. However, many people use the platform as a bully pulpit to say things they would never have the courage to say one-on-one. Don't do that. Don't hide behind the pulpit. If you got something to say to an individual, don't say it from the pulpit. Don't make it a general principle that we're preaching to the audience. Just don't. Go right to the individual and say it directly to them. Have courage. And if you don't have courage, don't bring it to the pulpit. Get courage. And then bring it to the person individually. Because that's just cowardly stuff. We're not going to win people over by attacking them, shaming them, or belittling them. They'll either dismiss us as angry people, or they'll become angry and defensive, and the conversation will be not productive, but it'll be counterproductive, and it won't lead to solutions. It will lead to further conflict and problems. And so, for this one, I've watched this build in my lifetime considerably, and I'm just praying it will go away in the church here in the next generation. With writing, you know, again, you're writing this kind of controversial stuff, just keep your goal in mind. What is your goal? Your goal ought to be to win people over to your side, right? That ought to be your goal. If you're dealing with a justice issue, it ought to be about dealing with something that you're trying to win people over. If your goal is to vent, rage, shame, and belittle, then you got the wrong goal. Okay? Do that in your journal so that you can process your hurt. Take it to your journal and process your hurt with God. Process your anger with God. But don't take it into writing publicly. Write it privately. And then afterwards, you can say it in a winsome way where you actually have the right goal, that is to win people over, and you can think about it. After you've processed your hurt, you can process it publicly in a way that's winsome. And that's your goal. Lincoln's progression as a human is always intriguing to me. Early on, when Lincoln disagreed with people, he belittled them and he attacked them. And over time, he learned that his far better approach was to make friends of his enemies. And thus this line, he writes, "Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends?" And he discovered if he could win people over and be winsome rather than vitriolic, he could actually make progress with some of them coming on board with some of his views. By the way, I know whenever I talk about Lincoln, there's a lot of controversy about Lincoln being a racist and all this kind of stuff. I'll just argue something on that matter for a second. There's a book out there by a guy named Stephen Mansfield. The book by Mansfield is called Lincoln's Battle with God. Has anybody read it? You should. It's a great book. It's a great book. It's not a good book. It's a great book. In his view of Lincoln's battle with God, the reason why it's a great book is this. There's a lot of people that have written their views about Lincoln's religiosity, about his faith issues, and so forth. As a matter of fact, there are people that have written that Lincoln was a believer, right? He was a Christ follower. There are people that have written that Lincoln was a spiritist, that he practiced, forms of spiritism because, his wife had seances in the White House and all kinds of other issues going on there. And so there's all kinds of views, everything in between. What I would tell you is people that have written he's a deist and all this stuff. Mansfield's the only guy who ever just looks at what Lincoln said about himself and his faith and looks at it, and this is the key phrase, chronologically. So what he did was he looked at everything Lincoln said over his lifetime, and he looked at the developmental progress of Lincoln's faith. It's brilliant, okay? The man is not stationary. So a lot of people look at a quote that he made when he was in his 20s and sum up his whole life by something he said in his 20s. Well, that's not where he landed in his 50s. Before he died, that is not who the man was. That's where the man was, but it's not who he was by the end of his life. People have done the same thing with racism in Lincoln's life. But if you actually looked at this, if somebody would write a book about Lincoln's views on race chronologically over his lifetime, what I would tell you is there's a development to it. And I have read over 75 biographies on Lincoln, and I can tell you there is a development in his thinking, just as there was about faith. Which, by the way, I'm not convinced he died as a believer. Neither is Mansfield. But all I can tell you is he certainly was a lot closer by the end of his life, and he may have died as a believer. But in the beginning, he was hostile towards God. And what I can tell you is there's the same development with Lincoln on his views with regard to the race issues in his day. So, anyways, all that to say, all of us are growing and developing as people. This is one of the key reasons why I want to show restraint and respect. I want to help people move to my friends and to my issue rather than creating animosity between me that loses my voice in their life. I don't want to lose voice. I want to befriend them. I want to move them. Whether you're writing or speaking, this needs to be our goal. Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends? I've said it to you before now, I'll say it to you in writing. The spiritual leader is always the most magnanimous person in the room. When you forfeit magnanimity, you forego spiritual authority. Just think about Jesus. Every room Jesus walks into, he is the most magnanimous person in the room. He is the most gracious person in every room he steps into, which, by the way, is what makes him the spiritual leader. John chapter 13, you know, it's interesting in this beginning of this is where Jesus washes the disciples' feet. And at the beginning, there's a statement John makes about he knew who he was. That's why he took the towel and started to wash their feet. It's because he understood who he was, that he felt like he had the ability to lower himself to this position of servanthood. It was rooted in identity. Magnanimity is always rooted in identity. That's the key. When it becomes vitriolic, we have lost our sense of who we are in Christ. And that is not the Jesus way. Jesus even shows respect to the people that crucify him, amazingly enough. If you rant and rave and shame, you'll only gain a hearing with those who already agree with you. The ones who disagree will either dismiss you or again be embittered and dig in. So say everything that needs to be said, but say it with honor. Treat people with dignity. Learn to be winsome. I listened to a debate one time between Ravi Zacharias, which most of you probably know who Ravi is, right? He's an apologist, an evangelist. But, you know, Ravi has a unique opportunity. Ravi gets to speak to highly intellectual crowds. He has literally had audiences with kings. And, you know, he gets to some people that nobody in the normal is ever going to get to. And I listened to a debate one time between him and an atheist. It's a really interesting debate. And it was so funny because it was very clear to me that the university crowd that was listening to this debate started pro-atheist, but they ended pro-Ravi. And this is what I mean by that. He was continually gracious to his opponent. And the other guy was constantly shaming, attacking, belittling, demeaning, mocking him. The crowd started in favor of the atheist and ended in favor of Ravi because of his sheer magnanimity. Now, I'm not saying they were convinced by the end that Ravi was right. I doubt that he converted that many that night. But what I am saying was, because they were open to him as a human, because he was so gracious, kind, respectful, and the other guy was not at all. At the end of the day, if anybody won the debate, it was no doubt who won. Ravi creamed it compared to this other guy. And those people went out of that room that day and went, I need to explore this more. That is what I'm talking about. I've seen this same principle over and over and over when I watch people who are gracious with people that aren't. In the end, they're always likely to win the day. Okay? All right.